Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Newark. I am Liz Carlisle. My pronouns are she, hers, and I have the privilege of being your worship associate today. I have been coming to this fellowship probably for about 30 years, hard to believe, and I have had an opportunity to do some absolutely wonderful things here that I would never have done otherwise. You know, organize social justice events, serve on boards, be president of a board, learn how to make good coffee. And right now I am the chair of the Pastoral Care team and the Helping Hands team, and I continue to try to make good coffee once a month. So this is just a wonderfully busy place. There's a lot going on, a lot of opportunities for you to come here and learn and grow. And
My name is Reverend Kim, and I serve as minister for UUFN. My pronouns are she and her. Come into this circle of compassion and care. Bring your worry and wounds, your longings and hope. With word and song, we rekindle the connection that soothes our tender hearts. With stillness and space to pause, we restore our strength for the work that must be done. The work of love, the work of waiting, the work of repair, the work of remembering we are not alone. Come, let us worship together.
So as chair of the Pastoral Care team, I wanted to just share a couple of reflections with you this morning. First, I have to ask, what did most of you do when you woke up to the headlines Wednesday morning? I suspect some of you hid under a rock, like I did, for 24 hours, completely awash in anxiety and despair. And I think I could have very well stayed there. But over the next 24 hours, I started noticing this flurry of activity among a lot of people I knew, but especially in this community, to come together with one another and try to find solace. Because I think it is in community where we find our love and hope. This is the safe refuge where we can put out our raw and trembling hearts and be there to share with one another. There's a reason we call gatherings like the ones that we had at the end of last week, those wonderful circles. There's a reason we call them healing circles. Speaking, listening, and being listened to with love and compassion is a balm for everyone. When we come together to support one another in pain, we are ministering to each other. We are, in a sense, performing pastoral care with one another. Now, there is a level of listening that goes much deeper and asks more of both souls, however, in a sharing. All of us are asked to listen to other people every day in our regular activities. And sometimes it is hard to listen to another person. We have our own jumble of emotions that get triggered by somebody else's words, and we jump in with our reactions or our experiences. Or we have such generous hearts, we just want to jump in and fix somebody's problem or somehow make them feel better. But deep, compassionate listening, the kind that is actually part of a lay pastoral care ministry, that calls upon us to give full, undivided attention to someone's pain with compassion, silence, and no judgment, to just listen. Again, this is hard. It is hard to sit in still, silent witness to another person's pain and speak only perhaps to reflect back or to ask a question of the person you're listening to for clarification. That is why our pastoral care providers here go through ongoing training under the guidance of a minister to learn this practice. And not everyone can do it because it takes discipline and detachment working hand in hand with heart. Those might seem to be contradictory, and that's where the challenge comes in. And we have a team here at UUFN that does deep, compassionate listening and does it very well. I am looking at all you folks in the front row. In a moment, I will introduce them all, but I first want to speak a bit to what they do, because there may be some folks here who don't quite understand the difference between lay pastoral care and pastoral counseling. First, both are components of a three-part pastoral care ministry here at UUFN. In the center is our minister, who has been certified in pastoral counseling in the course of their education in seminary. They are trained to deal with a level of counseling and intervention, if needed, that is outside the scope of what a lay pastoral care provider can do. Lay pastoral care providers, on the other hand, offer deep listening if you need someone to sit with you and just listen. Maybe you're lonely. Maybe you're feeling isolated. You're worried about getting through the holidays, especially now. You just had an argument with a significant other or with your kid. Or, as some of us may be feeling right now, we're anxious and sad and uncertain about the futures, and we need to step back from the ledge to a place of hope. A lay pastoral care provider can also serve as a point person for additional needs that might arise during your sharing. With your permission, they may refer you to the minister if your needs are beyond the scope of what they can do, or they may refer you to the Helping Hands team, which is a third part of our pastoral care ministry, if you need meals, transportation, or other practical support. So with that, I'd like to introduce our awesome pastoral care team. And my friends, I would ask you to rise as I call your names. First, Mary Barenschmidt. Mary is our pastoral care provider for this month, November. Kay Elizabeth. Jeannie Floyd. Sure. Lois Hoffman. Janet Louise. Allison Miller. And Reed Sahanik. The eighth member of our team is Beth Rausch, and she unfortunately could not be with us today. And last but most certainly not least is Reverend Kim, right here, whose gentle mentorship, guidance, knowledge, and skills as a certified compassionate listener helps us to be the best listeners we possibly can be. I think these words from Susan Patton Thiel's The Woman's Book of Soul well describe the work of our lay pastoral care providers. Quote, "The words hear and listen provide hints about the art of listening. Heart contains within it the word hear, and listen contains the exact same letters as silent. In order to hear what is being said and felt, we need to be silent and listen from our hearts. We must close our mouths and give undivided attention to others when they open theirs. That is the intent of your pastoral care team. I urge you to feel free to reach out to them, especially now. They are here for you. Thank you."
In our darkest moments, we don't need solutions or advice. We simply crave the warmth of human connection.
A gentle touch, a silent presence, These are the anchors that ground us when life's storms rage.
Don't try to fix me. Don't carry my burden or chase away my shadows. Instead, be the steady hand I can hold as I navigate my inner landscape. Sit with me in the quiet, bearing witness to my struggle without trying to change it.
Good. My pain is my own to feel, my battles my own to fight. But your presence reminds me I'm not alone in this vast, sometimes terrifying world. It whispers that I am worthy of love, even in my brokenness.
So, when the night seems endless and I lose my way, will you simply be there? Not as a savior, but as a companion.
Hold my hand until dawn breaks and I find my strength again. Your silent support is the greatest gift you can offer. It's the love that helps me remember who I am, even when I've forgotten.
Anyway, I'd like to share these words from Thich Nhat Hanh. These are from an interview with Oprah Winfrey in 2012. Deep listening is the kind of listening that can help relieve the suffering of the other person. We can call it compassionate listening. You listen with only one purpose, and that is to help him or her empty their heart. And if you remember that you are helping them to suffer less, then even if they say things full of wrong perceptions, full of bitterness, you are still capable of continuing to listen with compassion. Because you know that listening like that, with compassion, you give them a chance to suffer less. If you want to help them correct their perception, then you wait for another time. But for this, the time being, you just listen with compassion and help them suffer less. 1 hour like that can bring transformation and healing. The fear, the anger, and despair are born on the ground of wrong perception. We have wrong perceptions concerning ourselves and the other person, and that is the foundation for conflict and war and violence. We should be able to say, dear friends, dear people, I know you suffer a lot. I have not understood enough of your difficulties and suffering. It is not our intention to make you suffer more. It is the opposite. So please, tell us about your suffering, your difficulties. I'm eager to learn, to understand. You have to start like that, with loving speech. And if you are honest, they will open their heart and tell us, and then we are practicing deep, compassionate listening.
I'm sure a lot of us had a flashback to 8 years ago, right? And I looked at a sermon I had written right after the election, and I had written the following words. One of the most troubling things I've been seeing is that people who have different political beliefs don't seem to be able to talk to each other. I went on, I hear from people who say that they avoid talking to certain neighbors or acquaintances, or even some friends and family members, or they do talk, but they always end up in an argument. Yeah, so sadly, that hasn't changed for most of us in 8 years. I continue to ponder an important question that President Obama voiced recently, and that is, how do we see, hear, listen to each other in ways that allow us to meet and respect and recognize stories that enable us to then engage in common work? This is not a new question. In fact, it's a question that the Buddhist monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spent most of his life answering. This gentle, humble monk from Vietnam was called by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. an apostle of peace and nonviolence when he nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. When war came to Vietnam in the mid-1950s, Thich Nhat Hanh was a young man, and he and other Buddhist monks and nuns were faced with a dilemma. Should they stay in the monasteries and continue meditating? Or should they go out and help those around them who were suffering from the bombings and the turmoil of war? Thich Nhat Hanh chose to do both. A peace activist named Jean Knudsen-Hoffmann with the Fellowship of Reconciliation arranged for Thich Nhat Hanh's first visit here in the United States. He went on a speaking tour and led workshops with Vietnam vets. He then began traveling throughout the US and Europe and speaking in hundreds of venues to make the case for peace, calling for an end to the hostilities in Vietnam. Part of his message was this. He said, if we align ourselves with one side or the other, we will lose our chance to work for peace. Reconciliation is to understand all sides. His vision was to have listening groups all over the world, wherever there was conflict. And this was the beginning of his mission to encourage what came to be called the practice of compassionate listening. He challenged peacemakers to stay connected to all sides of a conflict, to humanize the people who were on the other sides. It's easy for us to look back at those times and say, well, what good did that peace work do? We're still fighting and probably always will be. I think it's critical here that we take the long view. If we do that, we might be able to see at least glimmers of progress. The arc of the universe is long, but it does bend toward justice. Futurist Kevin Kelly speaks to that bending. He observes that over the course of human history, quote, we've enlarged the circle of empathy around us, unquote. And think about some of the changes in just the past few centuries. He goes on to point out that our problems are a lot easier to see than our solutions, but also our capacity to solve problems is greater than we think, unquote. And our capacity to solve problems is growing. In order to create the future we want, we have to envision it. And we have to have faith that it's possible to get there. And remind ourselves that major changes in human attitudes can take a long time. But change is happening. And it might not feel that way right now, but we have to guard against cynicism. Within any movement for social change, there are always numerous groups with differing approaches. Until the most effective tactics are worked out, sometimes groups are at odds with each other. Back in the 60s and 70s, there were peace groups in the US that became frustrated with people like Jean Knudsen-Hoffmann because she had begun practicing Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching about staying connected to all sides of a conflict. Jean took small groups with her to listen to people like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. In Nicaragua, they listened to both the Contras and the Sandinistas. She talked with Palestinian Yasser Arafat and the Israelis. The frustrated peace activists were angry that Jean and her group members were listening to the other side. About 8 years ago, I took a course with an organization called the Compassionate Listening Project. This course was led by a peace activist named Leah Green. Leah had gotten involved in peace work in the early 90s. She led American delegations to Israel to listen to Israelis and Palestinians. Leah recounts, as an American Jewish woman who had lived in Israel and worked in the West Bank, my original vision was to strengthen U.S. support for Middle East peace by connecting Americans to Israeli and Palestinian reconciliation leaders and providing these Americans with a first-hand experience of the complexities on the ground. These were good intentions, but Leah and the other leaders found that the peace group members on these trips weren't really changed by the experience. These delegation members came into the listening sessions already on one side or the other, and they ended up just using the trip to validate their positions. It was really painful for Leah to realize these group members weren't really connecting with the humanity of the other side. Instead, they were actually adding to the conflict and polarization. Something was missing. In 1996, after leading 9 of these delegations, she sought out Jean Nutzen-Hoffman. Leah learned that the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh was one of Jean's teachers. Jean explained that the essence of the listening approach she was using comes from his teachings, that he called for peacemakers to humanize everyone involved and to cultivate compassion for those on all sides of a conflict. Leah realized that the heart was the missing piece. The heart, the source of our compassion, was the secret tool that her peace work had been lacking. So she adopted Jean's framework for compassionate listening, and Jean became her mentor, and together she and Jean began taking delegations to Israel and Palestine under a new organization, the Compassionate Listening Project. The participants learned to listen to both Israelis and Palestinians with compassion, no matter whose side they had been on. And finally, Leah began to witness the powerful transformation of hearts and minds that she had been longing for. The Compassionate Listening Project has gone on to do reconciliation work in many other parts of the world and here in the U.S., and they've adapted their trainings for peace building in everyday life. They teach participants how to listen with compassion in any situation. They teach powerful skills for peacemaking in our families, communities, on the job, and in social change work locally and globally. These are wonderful goals. And I recently became a certified course facilitator with the Compassionate Listening Project, and I'm teaching some of these skills to the pastoral care team, although they're already quite skilled in a lot of these practices. From its beginnings as an experiment in peacemaking, the Compassionate Listening Project has developed a number of very specific practices which can lead to genuine transformation and deep understanding between people. Some of the effects that we've been hearing about already this morning. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of these practices to give you just a taste of compassionate listening. We begin with the premise that we each have a core of love and compassion, and this is something that we're all born with. It's anchored in our hearts. But, of course, as we move along on the journey of life, things happen, and we're wounded, and we suffer. It's one thing we have in common with all of humanity. It could be the pain of being harshly judged, bullied, humiliated. It could be from abuse, pain or trauma from war or racism, sexism, homophobia, and the list goes on. Over the years, many of us develop layers of armor over our hearts to protect ourselves. But what happens in the process is that we also close off access to our hearts and our access to our core essence of love and compassion. So the first practice in compassionate listening is to cultivate our compassion, to try to break through some of that layer of pain and protection. Cultivating compassion includes developing empathy, being willing to step into someone else's shoes, seeing and feeling the world from another person's perspective to the extent that we can. It includes learning to forgive and letting go of old hurts. Cultivating compassion does take practice. It's really like building a muscle. The second practice is to develop what we call our fair witness. Let's say we're having a conversation and we're listening to someone. The fair witness is the part of our minds that can observe the whole situation without judgment. We observe our own thoughts and emotions and what's happening in our bodies and in our spirits. For many of us, when we're in a conversation with someone who holds different views and different values, we might get triggered, right? And we sometimes have a hard time managing our reactions. So by bringing to consciousness the non-judgmental fair witness, we learn to recognize and contain our triggers and suspend judgment long enough to keep listening to another person's story. To paraphrase Thich Nhat Hanh, if we want to correct their wrong perception, we can do that later. But for now, we suspend judgment and we just focus on listening to them with compassion and then responding in ways to help them suffer less. This can be very challenging, and that's why it takes a lot of practice. But with practice, we can learn not to react to their wrong perceptions and to just focus on being present and giving the other person our full, compassionate attention. Jean Knudsen-Hoffman described compassionate listening as listening with a particular attitude. She called it listening with a spiritual ear. She said it is non-judgmental, non-adversarial, and seeks the truth of a person. It seeks to see through any masks of hostility and fear to the sacredness of the individual. The sacredness that lies beneath the rhetoric. In this way of listening, we try to listen for what's under the surface. Is there fear or pain or something else? We listen for their true concerns and their wounds. In our normal communication mode, we might interrupt, we might roll our eyes, we might shake our heads, we might jump in and say, oh yeah, something similar happened to me, and then we tell our story. We might give advice or offer suggestions. Or how many of us have listened to the other person just long enough to find the flaw in their argument? Yeah. And so we can gather all our arguments and show them how wrong they are and how right we are. And there's nothing wrong with any of these things. It's all part of our culture and the way we normally communicate. But in the practice of listening compassionately, we take a different approach. We accept the idea that the truest, deepest guidance for each person resides within themselves. Each person has the capacity to resolve and heal their wounds, their pain. So our job isn't to fix or correct another person. Instead, our role is to help create the space and the conditions that make it possible for another person to discover trust in themselves, so they can develop their own wisdom to live the life that's uniquely theirs. It's amazing. Often, simply by giving a person the sacred space to be truly heard, they're able to take an important step in their own healing. We listen with a healing intention, and after the person has finished sharing their story, we respond from the heart. We reflect back to the person the feelings, the facts, the values that we may have heard, and ask them to confirm if we've understood and ask them to clarify if we didn't get it quite right. Being listened to this way is so rare in our society. It really is a gift that we can offer to another person. As Rachel Naomi Remen has written, listening creates a holy silence. When you listen generously to people, they can hear truth for themselves, often for the first time. And in the silence of listening, you can know yourself in everyone. Eventually, you may be able to hear in everyone and beyond everyone the unseen, singing softly to itself and to you. I'd like to invite you now to place a hand over your heart. And you might want to close your eyes and imagine for a moment a time when you felt strongly anchored in your heart. No stress, no fear, no worry. Maybe you were with someone you love, a partner, a family member, a child. And how did your heart feel? What kinds of feelings and qualities did you experience? A sense of connection, maybe? A feeling of openness? Compassion? This anchoring in our heart is how we prepare ourselves for listening with compassion. I can only tell you a little bit about compassionate listening this morning and how to practice it. Thich Nhat Hanh's vision was that there'd be groups around the world who would practice deep listening and teach it to others. It's a vision which has been carried by many others, and we could be part of realizing that vision, building bridges between our divisions. Imagine for a moment what that could be like. If more people everywhere felt listened to and understood, imagine what a world this could be. May it be so.